So in a few minutes, we're going to read together the story of Jesus' suffering and death as told by St. Mark. That is the booklet you have here. It is very long. It is an entirely too long to think about individual pieces of the story, but as we read this story, at first glance, it may sound, in fact, anytime we read the story from any evangelist, it may sound like the kinds of stories that we hear all the time. A good and innocent person is caught up and destroyed by an evil world of treachery, corruption, and betrayal. I mean, we do hear those stories all the time in the news and in our personal lives, and throughout history, people have often viewed the story of Jesus' suffering in those ways. And indeed, we're all sometimes tempted to interpret the meaning of the story of Jesus in terms of our own experiences and worldviews. Sometimes that's a good thing, but also it means that sometimes the story of Jesus' suffering sounds like a great conspiracy story. You know, the Jewish religious authorities conspire with the Romans to kill Jesus. Everybody gets together in the dead of night in sneakiness, and it makes for a great conspiracy story. But that is not actually the point of the story of Jesus' suffering. Sometimes this story sounds to us like a story of the excessive use of power. The Roman authorities exercised power arbitrarily and for their own political ends. It is, after all, to keep things peaceful and quiet and the way the Romans want things that all this goes down the way it does. And it makes for a great story of political corruption and abuse of power, but that also is not the point of the story of Jesus' suffering. And sometimes this story sounds like the story of how good people don't do what they are supposed to do. The disciples, the first followers of Jesus, all run away and they do nothing. I mean, it makes for a great story about how bad things happen when the good people do nothing. And that's obviously there, but even that is not the point of the story of Jesus' suffering. In fact, in the story of Jesus, everybody but Jesus comes off looking pretty bad. So if you want to wallow in how evil the world is, there is plenty to be found in this story. But that's not the point of the story. And if you want to pass out blame, there's plenty of that to go around too, but that also is not the point of the story of Jesus either. Yet while all those elements are there and do provide important things to think about, the story of Jesus is actually not what it first appears to be. That's because in Jesus, in the final analysis, Jesus is not the victim of Jewish religious intolerance, nor of Roman oppression, nor even of a poor choice of disciples. In the end, Jesus knows exactly what's going to happen, and he lets himself get into it for our sake. In Philippians, which we just read, Jesus is said to have emptied himself voluntarily. And as we read in last Sunday's gospel reading, Jesus somehow knew full well what was coming, and he stuck around anyway. And if that is so, then the story of Jesus' suffering and death is not the same old story that we hear all the time in the world around us. Because if Jesus has accepted this willingly, in spite of the fact that he can get out of it any time he wants, then something else is going on here. And the different thing that's going on here is that in and through Jesus, God is facing, entering into, and enduring the very worst of our human condition. In Jesus, God is entering the same old human story that we hear about all the time, but God is changing it. Because in the human story, conspiracy, power, and betrayal always seem to win out in the end. But in the story of Jesus, their power is broken. They don't win. Even though they continue to function in the world around us, they've lost. In the human story, when good people act badly, there is no hope. But in the story of Jesus, God redeems even hopeless situations. All the disciples flee, and yet it doesn't stop God's plan. And in the human story, life is always eventually turned into death. Nobody gets out of life alive. But in the story of Jesus, death is in the process of being turned into life. Jesus, like us, dies. But that is not the end. And if it's not the end for Jesus, then it's not the end for us either. So as we read the story of the Passion today, remember that this is not the same old human story, but God's redemption of our human story. And don't get caught up in asking who's to blame, but instead consider what it means for us that Jesus accepted the pain of our human story freely of his own will, dying even for those who ran away, and praying even for those who wanted him dead.